In any case, you know, physical London has always been, I think, a big component of your
Yes.
Charlotte and Pitt series.
Yes, yes, it has. It has an air of its own, and at that time it was the biggest city in the world and the centre of an empire, but stretched right around the world, which meant all kinds of people could be there reasonably without forcing it at all. People do ask me occasionally, well, why don't you set the story in Scotland? Well, I don't know Edinburgh and Glasgow, and there are many people who do, so I'd make a mess of it. And if I set it in the village where I live, as you know, there's only about 400 people.
Right.
You know, I wouldn't say there's never been a crime worth mentioning, but one would be about it.
Sure. Well, I think, you know, it's certainly plausible that in a city like London, you know, that people are there's crime going
Yes.
on and people are coming in and going
Interesting
out.
people of all sorts
Yeah.
of varieties.
Even the one where at one point Pitt, I think it was maybe the book about last, where he goes off to Egypt at some
Yes.
point in the investigation. Nevertheless, it's not peculiar that an international lot, including Egyptians, would have been in
No,
London.
Everybody comes and goes. I mean, there is a saying, which won't be true anymore, but you know, maybe 50 years ago was that if you stand on the corner of Piccadilly Circus, sooner or later, everybody who's anybody will pass by.
Yeah.
So
Well,
it's not a stretch to make all sorts of interesting people pass by. It's quite natural.
probably true. I think the same was true. They said that about Paris and the Champs-Élysées
Yes,
or
I should
something.
think so,
Yeah.
yes. Mm.
Well, the William Monks are set. Your Charlotte and Pitt series is really moving towards Edwardian London. You know,
A little bit, yes. I'm
right.
up to 93 now.
the later years of Victoria's reign. But with Hester and William Monk, you're back in the mid-century. So you've had a chance with them to write about the Crimean War, where Hester
Yes.
was a nurse. You did a wonderful flashback to 1848 and those revolutions.
That was fun. And because of I'm up to 63 now, I can do that because 48 wasn't so very far ago, far back. It can still have affected the people who are around, and it's a different sort of scene. And I put Hester into the Crimean War because I wanted her to be courageous and outspoken, and it would have been unnatural for a woman of that time unless she'd had an extraordinary experience.
Right, sort of well, Florence Nightingale
Yes.
really did have a tremendous effect, and so as an associate, so to speak.
And because she had actually been on the battlefield and she'd seen these desperate situations where she had to act without waiting for somebody's permission, or the person she was dealing with would be dead.
Right.
And so she got this steel in her backbone. But I wanted it to be outspoken but not anachronistic.
Sure, and she's been an interesting match for Monk, although certainly during great part of the series it was questionable which
Yes.
suitor was actually going to win her. You're a more polished barrister, or
Yes.
the rougher
Well, we've
William
got
Monk.
plans for him too.
Oh, good. Well,
Yes.
I figured you probably would.
Yes.
You take good care of your
Well, that's
characters.
the fun of a series. If you find somebody you like, you can bring them back again
Absolutely.
as many times as you want if it works.
Also, one of the things that's been interesting with the Monks is that Britain did play a role in the American Civil War.
Yes, indeed.
Had lots of stake in the American
Yes.
Civil War through the cotton industry and other things.
Yes, yes.
And so you were able to bring Hester and
Yes,
William
to
Monk
put
to
her-
America.
Yes, to put them actually on the battlefield and Monk to realize what it is that Hester does. And that was a little disconcerting for him because theory is one thing, practice is another.
You bet. But oftentimes it would be hard. You know, there are lots of British series where you know, American readers would kind of like to see how the Brits would
Yes.
behave, so to speak, over here. But it's not, especially with the policeman where he's going to have no writ, no jurisdiction.
No,
How do you
not at
do
all.
that? But it worked out really well with Monk on this sort of special assignment.
Yes, my editor at the time wasn't very sure whether that was a good idea or not. But the feedback I've had has been quite good. Nobody's told me, you keep your nose out of our Civil War, you don't know what you're talking about.
Well, I think it was perfectly plausible to have, you know, British agents. I
Yes.
mean, they were here.
Yes.
They were particularly active, I think, in Richmond and around the,
Yes.
you know, the Confederacy. I really enjoyed seeing things from that perspective.
Thank you.
It's
Well,
a
as
little
long
bit
as
different.
I kept it to a British point of view, I wasn't trying to be American, which,
Exactly.
of course, and in the war series, there were far more Americans involved before America joined than some people realize. And when I go through the research, I find that a lot of Americans came over at their own expense and were ambulance drivers, nurses, even soldiers.
Oh, you're back up to World War I now.
I'm back up to World War I. It's a sort of reverse. A lot of people came and fought or helped because they believed it was the right thing to do. I find that immensely admirable.
Well, it is. In fact, America didn't really go into the war to World War I until somewhat late in the game. The Allied,
1917.
yeah, exactly.
Yes.
The Allied
As a
Expeditionary
nation.
Force was
Yes.
right.
As a nation, but individuals did.
Exactly. But I mean, it took a lot of things like Lusitania and
Long after Lusitania, yes.
it was, because that
Yes.
was 1915.
Yes.
And then I'm trying to remember, what was the telegram?
The Zimmerman
the
telegram.
Zimmerman telegram.
Isn't that a book?
Well, it is. Yeah, absolutely.
Riveting.
I love it. And you know, there is an American author, and I'm going completely blank on who it was, who's written a mystery set, I must find it for you, in a post office in either Montana or North Dakota, but I'm thinking Montana, that all has to do with either the Lusitania or the telegram and some sort of...
Oh, interesting.
It is.
Yes.
Well, sorry, now I brought up because
Yeah.
I can't say anything more about it, but anyway, it was really fascinating. Something to the effect that something went missing
Yes.
in the postal system and surfaces, you know,
Yeah.
forever later in this peculiar
But that
place.
Zimmerman telegram was a real turning point in history.
It was. And
And
that was
I-
all about a comma, wasn't it? Wasn't it? The way they
Well-
the way they punctuated the message changed the whole effect
Slightly,
of
yes.
the message.
So, we broke the German code, the German naval code, but we couldn't let anybody know, because obviously if they knew we'd broken it, they'd change it, and our
Right.
advantage would be completely gone. And yet we had to let America know that this was what was planned, because it had to do with the Mexican armament and threat on the southern frontier of the United States. Germany was actually arming Mexico to invade, to
Right.
keep you out of the war. And their telegram telling their agent in Germany to invade, go ahead, we intercepted, but we couldn't let them know we'd broken the code, or we would have no further advantage. But we had to let America know and see the message, but it had to be routed as if we'd intercepted it in Mexico instead of intercepting it before New York.
That's right. Yeah, I'd
Yeah.
forgotten about all that. There's some parallels to that in the Enigma Code and Churchill's decision
Yes.
about Coventry,
Yes.
which didn't go in favor of Coventry.
No.
In World War II.
But then any decision you make that's of that nature, I mean, do we let the enemy know by giving away the information, can only be a judgment call, and sometimes you're going to be right and sometimes you're going to be wrong.
Well, that's absolutely true. So what was it after you've done, you know, certainly in the high 30s numbers of books, either in mid or late Victorian era, what prompted you to move to the First World War?
I think the essence of a really gripping, great story is conflict. Maybe conflict between nations, certainly conflict between people, but most of all, conflict within yourself. Intense decisions you have to make when it's not between right and wrong, but two rights and you can't have them both, or two wrongs and you've got to have one of them. And I wanted to set people in the most appalling conditions that you can possibly have and ask, is there anything that is worth having this kind of a war in order to save? Do you give way, or is there a point where you draw the line and say, beyond this, I will fight at any cost, my life if need be? And I think it's appropriate to our time, but I think that we all face intense conflict and decision. It doesn't have to be physical, it could be internal conflict and decision somewhere in our lives, and either we go forward and fight for what we believe, or we retreat and say, well, not me.
True. You know, it's interesting that you picked World War I. See, I think World War II is so much clearer about what was being fought for. World War
yes,
I
it is.
has always, I've always had a difficulty with World War I because it's a war that should have been settled early. It was so futile a war once.
It was, but there's some revisionist history now that is saying differently.
Really?
Which is quite interesting. And I heard about a book brought out about 2 days ago. I heard about it. Whilst I was here, I telephoned home just to see if everything was all right. Got to make sure the people, animals, and what have you are still as they should be. And this friend, well, you know her, Meg.
Mm-hmm.
She told me that this book has just come out, and there's quite a big series on television, a completely revisionist, that the war had to be fought. Otherwise, there would have been a German-Austrian domination of Europe. Now, I haven't read it, but it's quite interesting. I suppose because it really is history. It's the changing, almost the end of history and the beginning of the present.
Oh, absolutely. I think World War I really brought essentially the 18th, 19th century, that whole thing to a close, because when you think about the knock-on effects from that war, the revolution, I mean, look at Russia, look at, the Austria. I wondered, I was in
the fall
Vienna.
of the old monarchies, and the change of the role for women.
Well, that too. I mean,
It's
things
all the
to like
social
women's
changes
suffrage.
that were absolutely mind-blowing.
Mm-hmm.
were dated from then. I mean, Europe lost 10 million men